connecting. We'll see.
How's the morning been?
It's been good. How's your morning been?
It's good. All quiet here, which is good. Cold
Yeah,
in New York.
yeah. It's cold here. All right, so we're live, and it's a 2 cup of coffee morning. Look at everyone joining. This is great.
This is
Uh,
fun.
yeah. Hello, everyone. Feel free to write messages in the chat if you have any questions. But Scott and I will start here in a minute after we give a chance for everyone to come in. But yeah, excited to have everyone. Um,
Pumped to check this out. Thanks for the invite.
yeah, of course. I'm excited to ask you very hard hitting questions about Uber. And
Can't wait. We're
yeah,
gonna nerd out on marketplace. It's gonna be great.
yeah. Um, all right, a few more minutes. I'm going to put on Twitter that we're doing this, and hopefully all the folks show up. Um, but look at all these people. Uh, Talia, Michael, Joe W, Guy, thank you for coming. Um, it's great to have you. Uh, all right.
Thanks, Joe. Us too.
Yeah. All right. Well, we can start diving in. So I guess why don't we just do a quick intro? Scott, do you wanna introduce yourself? I mean, you're the famous one. You've gone on 20
No,
VC
you.
now and all of that. So I'm just me.
Why?
No.
Why don't you go first, and then I'll
All
pop
right,
in.
all right. I'll go first. Welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone. Colin Gardner. I guess self-proclaimed marketplace geek. I've been doing it for marketplaces on the operating side now for like 15 years, which is crazy, and I feel old. I also learned today that Waymo started 15 years ago today. So you know, love the business of overnight successes. But yeah, so I've been doing marketplaces. Now I run a fund called Yonder, which does early stage marketplace investing, pre-seed and earlier. And then I also advise and consult marketplaces. I've worked with, I think, now 50 plus different marketplaces, seen it all, and write a newsletter called Marketplace Memo, which just sends out weekly news on marketplaces, and also try to do some long form content about the future of marketplaces. And maybe we'll talk about my last one, AI and marketplaces, and what that means. But Scott, when you take the floor?
That sounds awesome. Can't wait. So I'm Scott, investor and advisor based in New York City. Joined Uber as employee number 99 a long time ago. Spent 6 years scaling that business. When I joined, we had about 10 cities. And when I left, we were doing about $10 billion in annual revenue. So it was an incredible ride. Loved the experience. And since then, I have been spending a lot of time thinking about marketplaces, what they are, what they should look like long term, and now just helping founders scale their businesses, and it's been really fun.
Nice. Is there any kind of business that you particularly look for, like, or where you feel like you nail it?
I think for me, it's really founder driven, right? Like I'm not one that pretends to know or have like an informed view of like, hey, this is going to be the next 10 or $50 billion company. I think like the best companies are sort of brought by the founder, and then it's my job to be able to help in whatever way that I can. So I think pattern matching is interesting. Some of the things that I think are particularly interesting right now is I think B2B marketplaces are super interesting. I think a lot of categories have been done in consumer, but in B2B, a lot of the payments are still offline. A lot of the flows are really manual. So I'm excited for how AI can kind of like speed up a lot of the transaction. I like vertical SaaS, particularly in like non-large TAM industries or unsexy industries. I love businesses. They don't always have to be sort of like venture scale. And those are the things that I kind of nerd out over.
Nice. Yeah, I mean I know venture scale is such like a small niche, right? In the scheme of things, and there's like majority of every other business in the world is not venture capital. Um, but yeah, well, we can talk about like maybe some of your time at Uber, which is I guess one of the most iconic Uber or VC backed businesses out there. Um, I guess like looking back on it, I'm really intrigued. Like when you first joined, was it obvious for you that it was going to be such a big success at the time?
No, no.
All right, well,
And
tell me about that.
And anybody that says that they knew that Uber would be a 140 or $150 billion company, was lying, right? Like, I think, like, the thing about this thing is you know that it's going to be an incredible company, and in that stage, a lot of companies are binary. Either they'll go on to have great success or, they'll die. But, I think, like, beyond our wildest dreams, like, yeah, like, it'll be $100 billion company, but, like, the reality of getting there was just very hard. We were in 10 cities at the time. It was very small. It was very we were getting banned in every single city. There was a lot of sort of, like, questions about the business. Could we start with black cars and then move down market into UberX and Uber Pool? Could we sort of, like, scale the model, in different cities across the US, and globally versus different competition? Could we, finally get the unit economics sort of like under control and stop burning money left and right? There's a really popular chart that's gone around over the last week that's been like Uber's cash flow over time, and it looks great until you look at like the y-axis and you see like, oh wow, there's a lot of money that went into this thing. But I think for Uber it was, hey, like we're playing the game on the field and need to fight these competitors. But at the time I joined, my calculus was kind of simple. I was doing consulting at a big firm, and if I stayed there for a couple of years, my MBA would be paid for. So I figured, hey, like if this goes well, maybe I'll be able to pay for business school. And if this doesn't go well, at least I'll have a good story to write on my application. So it was something I really wanted to do. But if you asked me like 10 years later, would we be looking at $100 billion company? I think that would have been hard for anybody to see.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I do I mean, I guess what got you, like, in the door, though? I mean, like, it wasn't immediately obvious that it was gonna be a success. Like, what was the hook? Like, what sold you on joining Uber?
I think it was a couple of things. One, the people were just incredible. I truly believe that talent density is the most valuable asset and extremely rare. But when you're 23 and you join something and you look around and you see people that are brilliant left and right, that's an incredible sort of experience. And it's something that's easy to take for granted. Every conversation that I had with early folks there just kind of got me leaning in further and further. And then the other thing was just kind of a curiosity around the market. As a consultant, I was traveling every Monday and Thursday. And, I had a driver in Atlanta that would take me to the airport and drop me off. And sort of as I was going through the process, I was like, hey, like, what are you doing during your downtime? Like, is there a hole for something like this? And, the more like I kind of like pulled on the thread, it got really interesting. And then I think the third thing was the product experience was just exceptional, right? You pressed a button, you got a ride. This was 2011, 2012. It was still so early in like web. And I think in terms of like smartphone apps, that it was just like a magical experience. And like, I didn't see any numbers. Like I had no idea how well the business was doing, or, how much trouble was sort of like lurking inside. And like every startup is chaos. And I think just not knowing that helped make a good decision.
Yeah, no, I mean, I look back at all the startups I joined, and almost your naivety is, like, to
Yeah.
your advantage by just looking over what is wrong and looking at what can go right in some very basic sense.
I mean, I looked at 50 different startups, right? I was
Oh,
flying out
wow.
to San Francisco on the weekends and meeting a bunch of startups fairly early, and nothing really clicked. And, you look back at that list now and, Uber was kind of like the one that really succeeded. But, I think it's a combination of sort of like blind luck, and sort of also, working hard.
Yeah, totally. I think if I recollect, my first interaction about Uber was, in we lived in San Francisco for about 12 years until we moved to Austin here, in 2017. But my wife rode a horse, and there was this woman that rode a horse there, and her boyfriend was at the barn as I was there too, and we were just talking, and I was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And he was like, "Oh, I work for this company, Uber." Is that Dom Naraducci? Um,
Oh,
and so very early engineer, and so we were just talking about it. And I'm like, "Oh, I got to go check this thing out." And so that was kind of like how I even just got like figured it out and like started using it, and then started losing engineers at every other company that I ever hired them for. So thanks Uber, but no, that
sorry about
it's
that. Dom's a
I
legend.
yeah. Um, I just remember the first time using it, and, like, I do think that there was that magic moment, right? Like, where it just showed up.
Yeah.
Granted, the trip was very subsidized, so that was really awesome too at the time. But it was like, being in San Francisco in that moment was like a very unique time and place, to just be able to like take advantage of like those things like Airbnb, Uber that were popping up then. So yeah. Um, so question on like Uber. I mean, like a lot of the times you hear this market by market playbook
Mhm.
from people. They're like, oh, the Uber model, this is how you should do it for your marketplace. Because I guess like we've heard a lot about what the successful model. But I'm intrigued to hear like what were the things that you guys tried that you would not recommend doing or that didn't work like
Yeah.
materially.
I mean, I think that in terms of like the market launch playbook, there's been like a lot of interest in that. And, maybe if it's interesting to folks, I put something together on that at some point.
Hmm.
There were a lot of things that we got right in there, right? But like we were playing a very different game than I think a lot of other startups should be playing, right? Like we were operating in a really competitive market. If we didn't go, other people would go and sort of
Hmm.
like go faster. Like just in the US alone, there was Lyft, there was Sidecar, there was Halo, and probably a few others that sort of I'm forgetting. So like we needed to go fast and sort of establish ourselves in markets very quickly. I think like if I were to look back on sort of the playbook and like some things that like we got wrong, I think that a lot of times we on the regulatory side, it was hard to know, like, should we go into this market? Should we not go into this market in the early days? And there were a couple markets that we had to kind of like pull out of and then come back later to. But I think that that was hard. And then I think the other thing is just like the incentive spend on the driver side. It was a very competitive market, and sort of what I always tell people about Uber is like people think it's about riders, but actually it's about drivers. If you're a
Hmm.
rider and you take 3 or 4 trips a month, or you're a very active person and you take 3 or 4 trips a week, that driver is probably doing 100 trips a week if they're really active. So, like the lifetime value of these drivers, if you can get them to stick, beyond 3 months or 90 days, is just very high. So I think understanding like what the things that you could do to lean into the driver experience more, and not rely so heavily on subsidies is like if I could wind back the clock, that would be something that I'd be more thoughtful about. I think
Huh.
that Lyft actually did a much better job early on in building like a driver community and having a relationship with the drivers than Uber did. And I think that that's something like I wish we could go back and do a little bit differently.
That's interesting. I want to like pull on that thread
Yeah.
because I do think like subsidies or discounts or things like that for companies almost like gives you false product market fit, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I guess like the question I have for you is like there's I guess there's two sides of that coin. One is do you getting product market fit like signal from that, but are also you attenuating someone to using your product because they get it cheaply and then they can they get used to it. And so I guess that's the question. Do you think it served that purpose like successfully, or could you have gotten where you needed to be without it?
I think for most companies, that is true, where you really know if you have product market fit when you pull off the subsidy,
Yeah.
and you see like what your retention curves look like. I think for Uber and ride sharing more broadly, there was just wild product market fit that does not exist in other categories, right? Like, to a degree, like we had like chat GPT type product market fit where you would try a ride and, this would be so much better than like a taxi or like public transportation or like or sort of like other options. And, you would want to tell your friends immediately. Like the word of mouth was really strong. And I think that something like that is very rare. So like, yeah, Uber had to do the subsidies in order to compete and look at market share in like a given market, like a San Diego or a Denver or an Atlanta. And if the subsidies weren't there, like maybe Lyft would have caught up or the market would have equalized at like 50-50. But it was kind of like a prisoner's dilemma where Uber's raising a lot of money, Lyft's raising a lot of money, Didi, Grab. And it's like if everybody's raising a lot of money and you're kind of like preparing for nuclear war, like nobody's really going to pull back and be like, oh, like maybe we'll pull back incentives 30% and see what happens. But at a point in time, there was very heavy like price competition between Uber and Lyft where we would update our prices and Lyft would update their prices, right after. They'd scrape our website and understand like what the updates were in a given city. And, it would be like, okay, Lyft cut by 25%, we'd cut by a little more. And it would just be like a kind of like matching thing. I don't believe that on rides, people are checking like dollars and cents to like, this is 5% cheaper, this is 7% cheaper, and sort of making a decision on that. I think people make decisions based on sort of like price, if it's like more than like 10 or 20%, or
Mm.
based on like ETA.
Yeah, I could see the ETA being like the thing that drives a lot of it, right? Is like you want the thing fast,
Yeah.
but it's like a marginal difference in dollars.
Yeah.
There was like so DoorDash when they went public, I remember looking at like their LTV curves, and I think one of the interesting things that they showed is like it doesn't you have to spend a lot to get people up on the usage curve for the
Yeah.
product, and then basically you can start pulling those subsidies away, and it's just really a marketing game to keep them going over time on it. And so I imagine that's pretty similar for Uber and Lyft, like on what they experience, right? It's like once you get people used to this and like away from whatever service they were using before, a taxi or a black car,
Yeah.
just by itself, that it's like it's hard to go back, right? It's just like the solution is so much better. Um, but I guess touching on, you were there with when Uber Eats went live, and so like the first business you guys were in was rideshare, right? And then ultimately into Uber Eats. I think what were some of like the market differences between going like launching rideshare versus launching Uber Eats? I'm just really intrigued by that.
Lot. We tried so many
Yeah.
different things on Eats that didn't work and then finally pivoted to a model that did. But, first, I think DoorDash is an incredible business. They executed like very well from the beginning and sort of like ran their playbook and sort of own a lot of the market in the US and done like an incredible job. I think for Uber, there were a lot of things kind of going on that, lessened our focus sort of on Eats. But when Eats started, I believe that, it was similar to sort of thing in LA where you had 3 or 4 meals. They would buy like out inventory of like 100 sandwiches, 100 this, 100 that. They would assemble them in underneath like a parking garage, where like drivers would come and dispatch at like 11 a.m. to like 1 p.m. hour. And they would kind of deliver them, right? And at the end of that like window, it was like, okay, there's all this extra food. I remember hearing stories of employees basically going and doing quality control so that when the food arrived, they take like a thermometer and take the temperature and make sure we were doing everything right. So it was a very strange sort of business. But it was one that proved like, hey, this is interesting and like we should be in the food game. There were a lot of other companies that were in the space. There was Postmates, there was Caviar, there was DoorDash, there was Grubhub, there were the Sprig, the Munchies, the Spoon Rockets as well. Very competitive category. But I think like if you think about ride sharing being like an asset light business, while Eats, like Uber Eats, isn't a business where you have a lot of inventory. The restaurants are taking the inventory risk. It's harder to convince restaurants to be on if all this money is going to waste unless you're buying out all their inventory. So it's harder to sustain. And I think the margins, just generally, if you look at like the earnings of an Uber and a DoorDash and compare it with like Lyft, which is a more like pure play ride sharing, or just look at the segment breakouts between Uber and DoorDash because Lyft is just a little bit different. The profitability and the gross margins on those sort of units is just different, right? So you have to do things a little bit differently.
So what's the better business? Is it a rideshare or is it a restaurant delivery?
I don't know. I mean, if you asked me like 3 years ago, I would have said rideshare. Actually, if you asked me during COVID, I would have said all in on Eats. If you ask me today, like it might still be Eats because we're headed to a driverless world, and there are a lot of questions, right, about sort of what
Yeah.
Uber's business looks like in a driverless world.
Well, let's unpack that because I think a lot of people are trying to figure that out. I've seen like a bunch of crazy opinions on what it means. But Waymo is obviously kind of at the front and has actually doing like real rideshare with driverless cars. I think the big question is do they just become a service that and the distribution comes from other from like Uber and Lyft, or like how does that play out? I'm intrigued to like how you see it going. Um, and
Yeah.
then other people mentioned Tesla as like, I don't know, a dark horse in this. So,
Yeah, I mean, you cut out for a second, but
oh,
I think I got you. It might have been my connection. But, I think I don't really know on the Waymo side and Uber and Tesla. I think it's very interesting. The bull case for Uber, and this is kind of like what people are talking about, is that it becomes like the aggregator for all the different driverless companies. And building a rideshare app is hard. Uber has, however many million clients around the globe, and, if you want to ride, you're going to be able to go to Uber and select from all the different fleets, whether, it's this company or that company or that company or that company. And like everybody's going to be like a centralized hub. And I think that's kind of the like pro case. I think also, there's also the narrative of like, hey, we've been talking about driverless cars for the last like 20 years or like 10 years at
yeah,
Uber. And, it was like Lyft said that by 2020, like, or maybe I'm misquoting the exact year, but they're like, all of our rides will be driverless. And this was in
yeah,
2015. It's like 2025, and here we are. But I do think the driverless moment has arrived. I think there's questions about, how long it's going to take to roll out driverless in like every city. Like, how many cars does it take to like cover a city? Like, how much is the capex? How much does the rollout cost? Like, what's the ROI and sort of the payback period? So I think like
yeah,
that's interesting for Uber if driverless doesn't come as fast, or if Uber becomes the aggregator. I think the more scary path for Uber is, you look at what companies like Waymo and Tesla are doing, and instead of doing things in a partnership way, right? Like Waymo's working with Uber in a couple of cities and sort of like working in other cities with other people. I think, there's a world where Waymo builds the Waymo app. They already have it now. From what I understand, the experience is really great in San Francisco and people really love it. And, they just decide to cut out the middleman and say, like, hey, like, why do we need Uber over time? And, they certainly have the tech capability and the ecosystem to do that. But, it's a lot of hardware, it's a lot of maintenance, it's a lot of like fleet stuff, and it may just make more sense to be with Uber. On the flip side, I think the elephant in the room is Tesla and sort of what Elon wants to do there. I think it's unclear, right? Like, I think that they've said that they want to run their own robo taxi network for a long time. I think
yeah,
that what's hard about what they do is they have FSD, and have done multiple like revs on that, and it's a very good product. But they're not used to like picking up passengers and sort of like pulling up and doing the door change. And I think that
yeah,
that's nuanced. So those are some of the things I think about. I think the reality is like there's partnerships that probably make sense um, down the road. And like I think like one thing that I'm seeing a lot of right now is like, oh, does Amazon buy Lyft, or does Tesla buy Uber? Like maybe. I think that if Tesla were to buy Uber or were to buy Uber, I think something like that would be create like a super app. I don't know how realistic it is. I don't have like a point of view as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing long term, but I'm really interested to see how the market evolves. What do you think?
yeah. I don't know. I think I'm noodling on it like everybody else and trying to understand it. I think what's hitting me on the head time and time again is like platforms can really win, right? And if you can go back to the basic of owning like the platform and the supply itself, you know, and it's like a 10x better experience, like the marketplaces will come to, or the demand will come to you in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And so I think that's like, I mean, if I was Uber, that's what I'd be like terribly afraid of is, you know, is that piece in particular. But I think, you know, Harry Campbell, good friend, the way he talks about it though, I think is interesting. He kind of mentions that, when you own a fleet, you have a lot of carrying costs to it. And one of the beauties of Uber and Lyft is that by spiking demand costs, right, you can actually incent more drivers to come on a road at a given time or things like that, but you don't have to hold the asset. So you're still like this asset light model. And so I think that's what I just try to remember and think about is like, like, how does that play into all the dynamics at the end of the day? Because there is a lot of carrying costs to the fleet, like you mentioned.
yeah,
And, you know, like how often do you have to keep them going, right? And
yeah,
to make it work, and like how that works. And maybe once you get over that cost curve of like, and you're in the profit zone, maybe it doesn't matter. But it is hard to imagine that if you have to keep holding all those assets, that you aren't capped at some capacity over
Yeah.
time. And so that's the thing I think that's what I'm thinking about a lot. And it's like a lot to think about every city in America having like driverless cars right now. Like I think that's a long time away, and the capex to get there is like just significant.
Yeah.
So
If there
that's
if
my
there
feeling on it.
if there are folks that are way sharp that have spent a lot of time in the Waymo or driverless space, would love to chat and spend some time
Yeah,
there. It's an area that I'm thinking about a lot, and I think it's very interesting.
yeah. If anyone in the chat has any questions on that in particular, throw them in there. We're like happy to answer them if they pop up. Um, I think if we'll give it a second, but if no one pops up any questions on that, we can move on. But I think you know, I guess at the heart of self-driving cars, right, is like AI, right, and like all of that. And so I think thinking hard about the future of marketplaces. One of the things I've been thinking about is like how AI and agents in particular kind of take over in marketplaces or like how they get involved. And it is interesting that, I think the last article I did on this was like, one of the things I hypothesize is that maybe the like AI agents become supply in the marketplaces. And it's funny is like this is like a very rudimentary way of thinking about this, but like self-driving cars are essentially that, right? Like
Yeah.
they maybe is one of the best examples of the use cases of AI is like where it becomes the supply is self-driving cars already, and
Uh,
we're here. So,
uh,
um,
I
but
mean,
anyway,
we made it 24 minutes without talking about AI agents in 2025, so I think that's a win.
yeah. Well, I mean, let's dive into it. I think I'm intrigued to hear your take on. I think everyone's had a slightly different kind of opinion on it based on the type of marketplace they've worked in and understanding it. Some people think, it's just like a tool. Some people think that there's no network effect behind it. Some think it's actually a really novel consumer application. I just see like all kinds all over the board, and I don't know. I'm intrigued with your Uber experience, like where you see AI kind of netting out in the world of marketplaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone through different eras of sort of marketplaces, and AI is sort of like the next layer. And sort of this is going to be different than any other era because in marketplaces, let's take a labor marketplace, for example, like an Upwork or a Fiverr or a freelancing marketplace. If you were the buyer, you'd say, hey, I need a deck done, or I need slides, or I need a thumbnail for my YouTube. Here are all the list of available people that I can buy from. And, you talk to a couple of them, you exchange message with them, and then you choose to hire somebody. And then a couple days later, you get something back, you put a review on it, and it's done. Now it's so interesting that a lot of these tasks very soon will be able to be done by agents, right? You might have Susie, an AI agent, or Alan, an AI agent that you contract with over like a Fiverr, right? Or some freelance equivalent. And instead of, giving them like an assignment and going like back and forth with them, you give them the context, you give them the brief, and then they kind of turn it around for you in like a couple of hours rather than, a week or a couple of weeks. And, I think that leads to a couple of things. One, when the compute cost comes down, it drops the cost on these freelancing services in a major way and sort of expands the number of buyers for them. Instead of, a deck design costing $1,000 or $2,000, maybe it costs $20, right? Like long term,
Yeah,
right? And I think that that's massively deflationary. But I think that also like there's a lot of human costs there too, and that's something like I'm thinking about too. The example that I like to think about, and I'd be curious to get your take, is there's been a commercial on for like Microsoft Copilot, and this isn't like a labor marketplace per se, but it's like a professional in like an office saying like, hey, like make that presentation in 30 seconds, and the presentation like the person puts in the prompt, the presentation gets
yeah,
made, and the person smiles and like aces their presentation. But I think it's like that moment where we all fly too close to the sun, and a lot of these jobs are gone because of products like Copilot. So that's some of the stuff that like I'm thinking about. But I'd be curious, like I know you wrote a great piece
yeah,
on sort of like the AI marketplaces, how you're thinking about it as an investor and somebody that's really knowledgeable about the space.
yeah. I think kind of what keeps hitting me over and over again, like to your point on the like that presentation making itself. It's like I think if you have very rote things that are very systematized, it works really well. But I guess being increasingly reminded that like people that have novel information or like a story, like it's still what matters, right? Like it's just these tools are actually going to be, I think, upskilling and essentially expanding the production capability of people that are already great producers. And I think that's like where the economies of scale will come and the like returns will go to are more to individuals that are like really prolific and original thinkers. Like I think that's what that keeps popping back in my head is that, for someone like me, for example, like somewhat creator slash investor, like all these different things, like I can actually do all those things pretty scalably now with AI. For example, for my newsletter, I've formatted a lot of it where I can just give it all the news I want and it spits out the format, right? And just being able to do that takes off out, like an hour of time, just like insane amount of time. And so I think about those things where I'm like, wow, I'm really excited about how AI can scale like our best thinkers and our best producers, and even make the average person more productive. So I think that's like I'm less worried about labor becoming this thing that becomes obsolete, and I'm more intrigued about what the like how people get enabled in new ways and what surface areas that creates. And so um, I think one of the things I'm interested in is like how AI becomes supply in a lot of marketplaces. Like for example,
Yeah.
like intro, I think we're both on there. Like people pay for time to go talk to us, but what I really don't like about labor marketplaces is you have to coordinate time between two people in a lot of ways, and that's very finite and discrete and becomes expensive. And so I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of opportunity around AI to actually step in and provide a lower cost solution for
Mhm.
information dissemination from experts.
Mhm.
Because a lot of people ask the same questions, and so
Yeah.
like that's in theory why I write things down on a blog, and maybe why you might write the Uber playbook, right? It's like because once you write it once, then it's like infinitely replicatable to everyone. And so I think there's this like that opportunity set exists with AI, but with like people themselves and like doing a very good rendition of like the knowledge they have. And so that's what I'm really excited about. I think one similarity it strikes me in this, and to Uber and all of this is that I think everyone's like, oh, it's AI is so cheap. It's like all this. It's like well, actually under the hood, it's like very expensive to run, right? And so if you go back to our first thing we were talking about of subsidies, right? My question is like, what happens when we rip the subsidies away from all of this, right? Like, and compute actually, it's going to go down in cost to do all these things, but at the same time, like, it's very expensive for these companies to run these like businesses. Um, and so I don't know. I'm intrigued by like that piece of it. Like when does the band-aid get ripped off, and like we actually see the true price of AI, and then what that does to usage. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. I think what we've seen so far from AI is that it provides tremendous operating leverage to companies. So if companies were to rip the subsidies away from OpenAI from AI, and like OpenAI, move their plan from $20 to $25 a month or $20 to $30 a month, maybe you'd see some drop off in consumer demand, right? But like the employees that are still expensing, OpenAI,
no, totally.
are still going to expense it, and the companies that are still buying enterprise plans are still going to do it. But I think like we're kind of in an arms race, in a much bigger arms race than sort of the ride sharing wars. That'll seem like a puddle compared to this. And, I think that you just have this reality where I think Microsoft said they were going to spend $80 billion on sort of R&D for AI in like the next year. And, the first thing that does is it says, okay, Microsoft is going all in. What is Google going to do? What is Facebook going to do? What is Amazon going to do? Because in the Magnificent Seven and sort of all of these larger companies, if you are not competing or keeping up, you're falling behind. And this is the most foundational shift since maybe the internet or the smartphone. And there are a lot of companies that you look at from the 90s that have just kind of like plateaued, like look at the Ciscos of the world, and nobody wants to be Cisco.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what's interesting in all of this too is like the time frame of investment. Like if we go back, like again, like Waymo is 15 years old today,
Yeah,
and now it is like all of a sudden a competitor with Uber,
yeah,
right? Whereas like I mean, but that was like someone thinking 15 years ago this should be a thing. Um, and now it is like an existential threat to a whole new business,
Yeah.
or to a business that they invested in, by the way, Google, right?
Yes.
Um, so that's whatever. That's the dirty laundry. But the point is I think there's like those things are starting to happen again with like the investments in AI with all the larger tech companies, and I'm really intrigued to see like which businesses are like the things that get disrupted just totally by this, like that we didn't even expect, like and it's going to take time because like we're a couple years in from
Yeah.
if we mark chat gpt launch as kind of the beginning of the AI era. um we're still like only 2 years in, right? And like
I
if you yeah anyway.
Yeah, to pick up on that, I'm very interested
Yeah.
in education, right? Like, I don't know if there's an
Mm.
investment opportunity in education, but if you look at like what's happened to businesses like Chegg that have just lost so much value because everything is sort of online, it's going to totally transform how we think about school for kids, how education like morphs over time, and I think that's a really interesting shift. I think healthcare is really interesting as like we can kind of bring down the cost of things by getting smarter about care, and I think it's just this incredible thing for society. It's just unclear like what the impacts are and who the winners are going to be and where the value is going to sort of like aggregate.
Yeah, no, I think that we're all in 100% agreement. We don't know what's going to happen,
Uh,
but we're excited by the future. um well, I think we should wrap up for everyone. We've been going for 30 minutes. But yeah, the AI marketplaces, big question mark. I'm excited to see it, but I do think the big things that I think are going to happen. One, there's going to be some supply side kind of cannibalization by AI, and it's going to be in ways that we don't think about. But I also think it's going to open up totally new surface areas and supply sets because of cost of like efficiencies, but also of like totally new areas that we hadn't thought about, like you know that become really interesting. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. Any last words on it before
no,
we
I
roll
love
it
it.
up?
This was super fun. Thanks for doing this, and
Yeah,
thanks to everybody for hanging out with us. If you
totally.
liked it, let us know. If you have ideas, let us know. This is a really cool platform, and Colin and I love marketplaces. So if there's ever any way we can help, feel free to reach out.
Yeah. And if there's any parting questions in there, get them in now. But otherwise, we'll wrap it up and get out of here. And I wouldn't be a good plug if I didn't say subscribe to our Substacks and see what we're thinking. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.